Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Sabrina Evans, Assistant Professor of African American Literature in the Department of Literature and Writing at Howard University. Dr. Evans specializes in 19th and early 20th century African American literature with a focus on Black women's writing, archives, and organizing. Her research examines the intellectual thought and literary production of Black club women such as Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Anna Julia Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells-Barnett, as well as the networks and communities that help sustain their intellectual and activist work. She is project co-coordinator for the Black Women's Organizing Archive, BWOA. BWOA is a digital humanities project that seeks to locate the scattered archives of 19th and early 20th century Black women organizers and create teaching and research resources. In this work, she has collaborated with a team of faculty, graduate students, archivists, and librarians to produce papers, locators, featuring digitized and non-digitized collections of early Black women organizers, as well as a digital map highlighting the various libraries and repositories holding their collections. Hello, Dr. Evans. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Hello, thank you for inviting me.
So we can dive in. I know that it is the start of your school year.
Yes.
Too much of your time. So how did you get into Black Studies as a field, and what keeps you committed to doing the work of Black Studies?
Yeah, so I did undergrad at the University of California in San Diego. And so in that, I was introduced to a lot of Black literature that I had not kind of previously been exposed to before that point. I do, when I think back before that point, thank my parents for giving me kind of a cultural grounding. They were very, focused on making sure I watched all the TV shows and films like Sanford and Son and the Jeffersons. And so I felt always interested in kind of wanting to kind of hear more about the people that kind of was mentioned in those shows as well. And so it really changed my viewpoint because in other courses I took, there might have been like one Black figure that was mentioned, and that was kind of it. And so that really shifted me into wanting to get into the field of African American literature. And then once I went to graduate school at Penn State University, I took classes with Shirley Moody Turner, who later became my advisor, Keith Gilliard, big in the field of African American rhetoric. And so through that process, I eventually applied for Penn State's PhD dual title program that was between English and African American and diaspora studies. And with that, I had the opportunity to kind of take classes in philosophy, women's, gender, and sexuality studies that really kind of gave me more of an interdisciplinary perspective on Black studies that, again, I just was not finding in my kind of home department. So that really kind of started my interest in the field. And then I was given a lot of opportunities through my advisor to get involved in digital humanities and public humanities work and thinking about how do we make Black records accessible to communities within and outside of the academy. And so I really kind of through that interdisciplinary training, it really opened my eyes to how do we center Black theorists and activists and how we teach literature.
Thank you. So I want to ask you a little bit more about the making Black records accessible, both within and outside of the academy. I think that particularly right now, that is necessary and vitally important work. So do you want to speak a little bit more about both the work that you're doing with the BWOA, but also just the importance of making Black records, first of all, finding and preserving Black records, but then making those things accessible to the community and as well as the academy?
Yes. And so, again, a lot of it was based off of the kind of advisors and folks that are leading these projects. So Shirley Moody Turner is one. She's the director of the Black Women's Organizing Archive, but also Gabrielle Foreman, where they both kind of co-founded the Center for Black Digital Research at Penn State, in which they provide, myself and many other graduate and undergraduate students the opportunity to kind of see how do we find these records. We worked with archivists and librarians that kind of taught us how they kind of do this work. And particularly with the folks that I study, which is very focused on 19th and early 20th century African American intellectuals and activists, their papers are scattered. Like they're not all of them, particularly Black women, have their like a dedicated archive of like Frederick Douglass's papers or W.E.B. Du Bois's papers. A lot of times they get subsumed under, the names of their husbands or other Black figures. And so you have to do a little bit of detective work to kind of find them sometimes where maybe they had correspondence between each other, or maybe for some reason it just went in this other larger category that's often like Black men kind of focused. And so being able to kind of learn how do we find them and then how do we kind of pull these resources together so that it makes it easier for the next researcher, the next student, the next, anyone who's interested to kind of access these records. So with the Black Women's Organizing Archive, that was one of the projects we did where we worked together to kind of as we're focusing on 4 women, and Julie Cooper, Mary Church Terrell, Marianne Shad Carey, Frances Harper, where are their papers and can you access them online or do you have to go in person? And so we created a list that we call like a papers locator or papers directory where you can kind of see here's the things that are digitized that you can access online versus here are the items that you do need to kind of go to that location to access. So that was a big first part of just how to locate them and kind of put them in a central location that anyone can access. But then the other part is how do we let people know like where it is? And so there's a lot of public events that we put on. One of the events that frequently Dr. Foreman, Jim Casey, and Denise Berger organize is Douglas Day, which happens every February 14th, where we're celebrating his birthday, but we're also inviting communities to kind of come together and learn about different figures of the 19th century, not just Douglas, even though we're celebrating him. And we ask them to help us transcribe some of these documents, meaning a lot of these materials are sometimes in cursive. We're also living in a world where students are not being taught how to read cursive anymore. And so it's really helpful for where we invite communities to kind of be like, okay, if you have been taught cursive, help us transcribe this into type so that anyone can kind of access and learn from these documents. We're also intentional about who is invited to these particular events. So if a Black figure, let's say they're connected to a Black sorority or fraternity, we're like, hey, we reach out to them. Would you like to come? They were a member of your sorority, or maybe they founded that sorority or fraternity. We reach out to different like Black churches. We reach out to schools in the area, K through 12, and we offer lesson plans. And so a lot of it is geared towards, again, not just kind of keeping the information with the academy, but thinking about what are some communities that might have some awareness of this figure, might have some connection to their history that can kind of help us do this work and share this work.
Thank you. That's so vitally important. And it's such a good way to be able to draw more people in, right? And I think particularly thinking about what is not being taught, like something like cursive that's no longer being taught in schools. How just like the removal of that as a requirement or an expectation really impacts who can access what. Because if you can't read this, then what does that mean for your ability to engage with it and to know that information? So thank you for talking more.
Exactly.
I think everybody should go check that out. But so thinking about how the work that you are doing is in digital humanities, you also have your specialization in African American literature. Your degree, you had African American literature, diaspora literature, and just thinking about the ways in which the field of English or English literature, how that has particular roots as well as expectations around it disciplinarily. So how do you situate yourself in relationship to the different fields and disciplines that your work crosses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what I kind of take from my training in English is largely that attentiveness to close reading and literary analysis. I think one of the things, particularly with how I teach, is that a lot of students are aware of some of these names. Maybe they see it, especially at like Howard. It's like a building named, Douglas Hall or Elaine Locke Hall. Or you'll see streets named after particular figures, but they've never actually read anything of them. They just know of their impact, certainly like that they were working for an anti-slavery movement or other kind of Black feminist movements. But beyond that, they're not kind of engaging specifically with, well, what were they saying? And so that's a really key aspect of what I take from the training of being like, well, let's look at what they're saying, and thinking about how that can teach us about how they were doing activism, how they were thinking about issues around race, gender, and identity that students can really connect to in different ways. Because as you're kind of reading these works, you see a lot of kind of the changing same of what are the same conversations that are coming up, albeit certainly in different historical contexts. But there's many things that you can kind of relate to. So if I'm thinking about Ida B. Wells-Barnett, who's being, this pioneering journalist in the field of really documenting anti-Black violence and lynching kind of across the United States, how do we think about how that applies to our current environment when we're having anti-Black violence kind of continue? And what can we learn from what her strategies and how she was writing about these issues and exposing the kind of white supremacist ideology that was rooted in that anti-Black violence? So I think that close reading aspect is where I take from English. And then as I expand into Black studies, it's again that notion of like, how do we really center their work and their perspective and think about how they themselves are pioneers in these different fields. So I already mentioned Ida B. Wells in terms of, journalism. There's others that are, philosophers and should be thought of as philosophers, are not always kind of considered philosophers, but or race thinkers or critical race thinkers, but they are. And so I think it changes how we approach reading them and really wanting to elevate them to the greats that are taught in, let's say, other English courses like Shakespeare. We need to think about them in those same ways.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So you mentioned towards the end there, like thinking about Black philosophers and writers and journalists and just the work that Black people and Black organizers have done, elevating that to the same level that other classes might think of as in terms of like teaching Shakespeare instead. So how does the work that you do in the classroom, how is that informed by Black studies? And I know obviously it's who you're centering,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm particularly interested in what a class that is focused on African American literature, how that might look different than a class that is focused on Shakespeare.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. So I think, again, it is a kind of in-depth focus on these particular figures and their literature and thinking about how they are kind of communicating and presenting their message in different formats. So there's kind of several levels I approach it in the class of one, like, let's actually pay attention to what they're saying in their writing. Let's expose you to a variety of different genres that African American writers are participating in. That's when I kind of bring in the print culture, Black print culture element, and recognizing the fact that in the 19th century, it was very expensive and very difficult for a lot of Black writers to get published because of racism and sexism and so many other isms during that time. And so how did they have to shift how they craft their message to get to the audiences they wanted to? So was that publishing in, African American magazines and periodicals? Was that handing out, Ida B. Wells handed out pamphlets so that it was easy to kind of distribute and it was cheap to distribute. And so that's another level of thinking about the different genres and showing that they're participating in these same spaces, though they had to kind of navigate these kind of politics of publishing that are happening during that time. And I think in other ways, sometimes I teach writing courses, like first-year writing courses, from an African-American kind of Black studies perspective, where it's like we can, look at speeches by Black writers. We can look at kind of short pieces, articles that kind of center their voices, but are still teaching students, like, how do we read this from like a rhetorical standpoint? How do we read this from a literary standpoint? How might, if somebody's, doing work with political studies, how can we view their work in that way? And so using it as kind of grounding them in the text themselves, but also showing that we can have these classes with a Black studies centered approach and not have to kind of sometimes just read, the textbooks and the anthologies that are so often kind of taught in those spaces.
Yeah. Thank you. So this was not a question, but I am very interested in that. As somebody who also taught first year writing for a while, what have you noticed? Well, I guess the first question is, have you taught first year writing like other places outside of Howard? Okay.
Yeah.
So have you noticed a difference in teaching it from a Black centered perspective at an HBCU versus at a PWI?
Certainly. So I did teach first year writing at Penn State, which is a PWI. And so with that, I, I kind of was I had to do a little bit more kind of grounding work of being like, okay, here's who this person is. This is why this is important. And here's the kind of strategies that we're trying to pull from this. Like we can still, talk about, ethos, pathos, logos through these pieces, but also help you learn something about American culture, American history, particularly African American history. And I kind of am upfront with that to be like, in this class, these are the types of texts we're going to be focusing on because, this is something that I hope that you'll get exposed to that you might not be exposed to in other spaces because, as we know, first year writing is a mixture of students. They're required to take this. They're coming from all sort of backgrounds, and I'm like, if you might not get this in any other class, but this is what you're gonna get here. So that was very like something that I would speak of at front, and I'm like, if that's not something you're interested in, you can drop my class. But this is what we're doing. Versus definitely teaching at Howard. I don't have to do as much of that grounding. I mean, certainly I do some because, again, they might not have learned any of these figures. They might know their names, but they might not actually have read, different pieces from them. But I think it's a little bit more engaging because they're able to kind of get those connections really quickly to be like, how does this apply to my current environment? Like, what does this make me think about, my own identity, my own history? And they're really wanting to kind of have that exposure because it's the same thing. They're also coming from different majors and fields, and they might not, again, this might be the only writing or literature class they're going to take their entire time at Howard. And so they're like, yeah, I always do a survey where I'm like, what do you hope to get out of this class at the beginning? And they're like, I want to know more about my culture. I want to know more about what writing and, the 19th century looked like and how that can inform how I think about, myself and my own career interest.
Thank you. I've only taught writing at PWIs, so I was curious what that experience is like in an HBCU space. So thank you. So building on that, um, what interests you most about the past of Black studies?
I think what interests me the most about the past is how much of Black studies as a field came as a result of Black student protests at different universities and colleges where they were not getting exposed to these figures. These figures were not seen as important. They were not, again, I keep using the Shakespeare example, but they're not kind of being considered of like, I can have a course on Toni Morrison. I can have a course on Zora Neale Hurston. And that should be just as valuable a part of, learning about literature or, any other fields. And so that is what I really bring into is always thinking about and telling my students that this started from students like you that are desiring this knowledge and feeling that it's missing from their kind of curriculum. So that's what I think about in the past. And I think, again, in our current political moment, as, Black history and culture are being erased, removed, disregarded in many ways, I think Black studies is a place that they can turn to kind of still get that exposure and kind of not have this sanitized message about, slavery that is trying to be promoted in our current political moment.
Having a conversation about that earlier today. Like, we're going to change. They like with the pressures to change the Smithsonian.
Yes.
Guys, slavery, which has been happening in K-12 curricula for a while. But I think I saw a post this morning where there was a quiz. Somebody posted a screenshot of a quiz their kid had to take, and it was talking about Phyllis Wheatley, asking about why was she able to be educated, and it was like she was bought by whoever. those white people were. I don't remember their names. And then eventually adopted by them.
Mhm.
It's like, oh, that's
That's not
that worked. But
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's such
that's
a good point because I literally again, this is my first week of class, so we just read Phillis Wheatley, and we read June Jordan's The Difficult Miracle of Poetry or something like a sonnet for Phillis Wheatley that is all about, like, let's think of what it would have felt like for, a 6 or 7-year-old girl to have been kidnapped, brought on the ship that she was then named after. The slave ship was called Phyllis. She's, enslaved by the Wheatleys. So again, the Wheatleys were her slave owners. And let's think about, how might we think about her perspective instead of, again, like you're saying, that message of she was adopted. They educated her. She learned Latin and all of these other languages. Like they were so benevolent. And it's like, okay, but what do you think her perspective might have been of this
right.
experience? Mm-hmm.
She was literally kidnapped and stolen from everything that she ever knew and forced into this. But no, they were so they provided an education that she would not have otherwise.
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
That is something that I am not. My daughter's in 7th grade or going in 7th grade. So she always comes home and has these rants about the framing in her class. Like, I don't think this is right. I'm like, no, it's not how we're gonna look at that.
Mhm.
But so is there anything about the history of student protest, I think is one, super important because it is what led to the institutionalization of Black studies, which there are many things that can be said about that period. But I also think that knowing that history, particularly right now, is going to be super important because it's without that student driven engagement, Black studies does not survive in the academy at all, right? Which isn't to say Black studies doesn't survive, because Black studies is not just in the academy. But are there things about that past
Mm.
that you think are particularly important to emphasize to students right now, or to make sure that we're introducing them to or reminding them of if they did like watch certain shows, but then that's not didn't necessarily make the connections, things like that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think with that, just being attentive to the folks that kind of started, like to Indian history, like who started this. So thinking about those early professors that founded those programs and, you know, might have been fired after, but the program continued. And so, again, I think speaking to that student advocacy, again, in the current moment where we're seeing a lot of these programs be erased. And so being like, you have the power to, advocate for this and replicate those same, efforts that happened in like the 1960s and 70s. Even like learning on their campus, do they know how the program started? Like I'm thinking so much about, different universities in California, in San Francisco, even at, again,
Mhm.
my alma mater undergrad, UCSD, like that program was created because of student protests. And I think that's really essential to understanding like how these challenges were faced, how they were overcome, and how they kind of continuously need to be negotiated, and making sure that they're getting what they want from these programs. I think a lot of times you'll have students being like, oh, I wish I could take a class in this, and it's not there. So just really being able to kind of use history to show that your voice can be heard, and you can have an impact if you kind of come together and kind of ask for it. So I think that's a huge aspect of like kind of teaching, like, how did this program get started? Who was there, who's not there. One of the things, again, specifically at Howard that I'll emphasize is I love kind of speaking to, this person was a Howard alum, Carter G. Woodson was a Howard alum, Zora Neale Hurston. And so it really kind of grounds them in like learning, like they read about these figures, but thinking about like they were here, like geographically, like they were walking the
Right.
same streets and halls as you are. And let's have that conversation. Like, how might we, knowing that they're from these areas and from these programs, what does that teach us about how they're thinking and how they were educated? And I think that's how I really kind of think about how do we use these past Black Studies programs to kind of have these types of conversations.
It's such an important point, but particularly like at Howard. Like
Yes.
so many people came through Howard that it's kind of like there are a plethora of examples to be like, nah, so they were here. Like there's a hall named after them for a reason. They were walking here. They were taking these classes. They were engaging in this space within a different context, but they faced similar challenges. And so thinking about the ways in which the strategies that they utilized and the work that they did to make it through that
Mhm.
space in that time, I think is, as you said, is vitally important. So what interests or excites you about the future of Black studies? Or even like, where should we be going in this moment, given everything that is happening?
Yeah. I think first, again, like the thing that I appreciate the most about Black Studies is its opportunities for interdisciplinary work. I think now more than ever, we do need to make sure that we're not siloed in our own departments and areas and that we're reaching out to other departments like political science, philosophy, women, gender, sexuality studies, or however that is an iteration at your university who are also studying the same figures you are, albeit from different perspectives. But I think that's so important to kind of not only speak to the impact of, these figures in Black studies, but also thinking about like how can we collaborate? How can we help each other? How can we put on conferences and invite students to kind of learn about their impact in different ways and different approaches to kind of thinking about them. And I always kind of, that brings me back even to like first year writing, where it's like, I tell my students like, hey, you're coming, like most of you are not English majors, but is there some sort of like entrance into this material that relates back to your own interests? Like, again, are you, interested in law school? Are you interested in, even I have a lot of nursing and medical student or people interested in pre-med. And I'm like, hey, did you know that Harriet Jacobs worked at this hospital? Like what is now, Howard Hospital? And so I think trying to make those connections and really advocate for like, this is important regardless of what field you're in. And recently I was just in a program that Howard put on for bringing together faculty kind of across departments, and we all like presented our research. And I did it last year as well. And there was someone who was like an architect. And she was like, hey, my students did this whole project where we imagined how might we use the space of the house Mary Church Terrell stayed in and revitalize it as a community space. And I was like, I didn't even hear about this. You're working at the same place I am. So I think it really speaks to like why we need to kind of think more interdisciplinarily because it invites these moments of connection that otherwise you wouldn't kind of find.
Thank you. That's super interesting. Like the reimagining that space as a community center from an architectural standpoint. That's super interesting. But I think you're right in that like the academy can be so siloed. And you have so many people who are doing work that is related and intersects, particularly with Black studies. But if you're in this department over here and that department over there, in this program, in this center, you're not necessarily having those conversations to make those connections and be able to facilitate a more collaborative effort at getting things done.
Mm-hmm.
So that is a vitally important point, especially right now.
Yeah. Can't say that enough.
Can't say that enough, as we're moving forward. Other things, is there anything else you wanna add about, like, current projects you have going on or just maybe, like, a message moving into your new I still got a couple weeks.
Yeah, I think, I feel like I spoke about the interdisciplinary nature, but I do want to, again, just like ground down this idea of like going into the archives and also thinking about ways that your families can consider like archiving their own stories so that they don't get lost. a couple years ago, I participated in this program that I think it was through like AARP or something like that. And they wanted to partner with a couple of us at Penn State to kind of meet with kind of different kind of seniors and elders in the community and talk about like what are some strategies you can use to preserve your own stories. If you have, papers in the attic of, your grandparents or your great grandparents, thinking about where you can go to like make sure that it's preserved, whether it's their local library or, a certain university, if they had ties to a university, to not be afraid to kind of make sure that they're kind of being taken care of, because otherwise that history would be lost. And one example of that that we did before we were doing it like a Douglas Day project on Marianne Shad Carey, where they reached out to like her descendants. And Marianne Shad Carey was this like Black woman born in the United States, and then after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 decided to like move to Canada, and she became one of the first Black women to basically edit a newspaper. And so her family is in Canada. They reached out to them, and they had talked about how they had found some of her materials, again, from like the 1800s, and it looked like scraps to them. They almost were going to throw it away until someone was like, hey, can you take a look at that? And then you had this like so much fruitful material. And so I think it really is valuable to kind of, if you have any kind of family records that would be valuable even on your local level, your regional, whatever, make sure you're preserving that not only for yourself, but for, your future children and grandchildren. That's one of the things I personally regret, because my grandparents passed when I was younger, and I was like, ugh, I wish I could have like heard your stories of what it was like to live in the South and all of these, in Jim Crow era, because my great grandmother was born in the 1920s, but that's lost. And so just think about the importance of archiving and of visiting archives and using these materials and realizing that most of them are accessible to everybody, and thinking about ways that you can kind of bring that into your classes of like, how can we go beyond just kind of talking about the impact of these figures in Black studies, but actually like, who are they writing to? In my work, I'm really fascinated in thinking about who they were writing to, what communities were they part of. When I think about, particularly the Black club women's era, which is what I focus on, where we see a rise of Black women's clubs responsive to kind of racism they were experiencing in early feminist movements, mostly kind of being led by white women, and not having a space for themselves. In the 1890s, they started kind of creating all of these clubs where they can kind of focus on their own issues, their own priorities. And so I'm like, were they talking to each other? Because a lot of times, you hear, Ida B. Wells-Barnett, she was a Black club woman, but you don't think about like, who was she talking to? And so I'm really curious about those connections and what that can kind of teach you about the individual versus the kind of collaborative or the organizational that I think isn't studied as much.
That's such an important point. Like, one, who were people talking to? But also just acknowledging that, like, they're all operating at the same time. And so even if they weren't necessarily in direct conversation, they were aware of each other, and this information was there. Like, there was a shared consciousness that people had about what was happening in different spaces at the time. Which also goes, like, as you said, goes back to understanding the collaborative nature of things that were happening, even if not directly. And then, yeah. I also want to just echo what you said in terms of seeing about preserving those family records. That's something that me and my sisters have been thinking a lot about in recent times. Both of our grandmothers passed recently, and so really thinking about how we can maintain the records and learn more from what is left behind, right? There's not necessarily a ton of written word, but like with the pictures and the yearbooks and the things that you can learn so much from if you are able to go to the archives.
Yes.
And research that context. Yeah.
Yeah. My mom is kind of our new family historian, and she has this whole wall in her house where she's created like a family tree. where she was able, based off of those photos, to be like, this was your great uncle, this is your great aunt, like this is how, the family tree is created. And it's just such a helpful, like, even for my niece, she's like, oh, like to see their names and just to visualize it and like where we came from is also like an archive that you can kind of create for yourself.
And to have a visual one is so tangible, right? To be able to see there, because so often they're, particularly if we're talking about Black communities going back more than a few generations, there's not necessarily as many pictures or that much of the visual evidence. At least not. Again, my family's from Mississippi, so in that sharecropping space, you don't necessarily have a bunch of photographs or pictures that have survived past maybe 100 years. So, yeah, that's super cool and important. Okay, now I'm thinking about like the kinds of archiving assignments that you can have.
Yeah, I've done some in the past. This is more so, I mean, I guess I should think about applying it in different contexts, but for my first year writing kind of class, I had them kind of do kind of archiving like projects to kind of be like, make a podcast, like interview a family member and ask them about like your history. And then they can have that, forever, really, depending on how they preserve it, to kind of push them towards thinking about that. Or if they wanted to do some sort of like, Canva presentation that's kind of, maybe they wanted to do like a family tree type thing for themselves. And so I think there's ways of depending on the information they're able to glean, like if their grandmother, great uncle, or somebody's still around, like interview them, ask them these questions. One thing I know about the elders in my family is they will talk. Like, they might not answer your question, but they will talk. And I think just like even hearing the kind of stories that they tell that you don't think might not have been answering what you wanted to answer, but are still telling you how they're perceiving of their past is very, very fascinating. And it makes me think so much of Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon. We're going to interview the last survivor of the last slave ship. And just her approach where she's asking him like, hey, like, I want to know the answer to these questions. He's like, to answer that, I'm going to have to go further back and tell you about my family. And she's like, well, I didn't really want to talk about it. He's like, well, this is what you're getting. And then he's like, okay, I'm done. Come back tomorrow. So I think, yeah, it's just using interviews potentially, which is, again, is teaching them a skill of, how do we, present information in a podcast differently from, another medium while they're also kind of being able to preserve history.
Yeah.
How
And the importance of like what it means to do that type of research gathering, like thinking about what it means to interview somebody and then to represent their words in different ways. I know when I talked with Martha Jones about her book, The Trouble with Color, she was talking about how, like, one, she might not have published that book if certain people were still alive. Like, but also, like, thinking about the stories that people tell versus the different versions of stories that people tell, right? And what that can reveal too. And when I talked with Mary Phillips about her book on Erica Huggins, what it meant to publish a book about somebody who was still alive and the negotiation that happens around what somebody shares with you and what they're willing for you to share with others. Because that's not necessarily the same thing, right? And so what does it mean to interview a family member and get the information down and then think about, okay, what portions of this am I going to share for this assignment or for the record for, a broader audience versus what I'm going to keep to myself for now, at least.
Yeah, that's a good point. But it's also just, I mean, I haven't done this either, but what you're speaking to about, what might have been the written record versus what is the oral storytelling tradition that's kind of passed on. especially when we're thinking about the Black community. Like, I'm thinking about, stories my family told about, like, oh yeah, this, uncle or whatever was lynched at this tree, but like if that there's no record of that, or if it is, it's like, he died from an accident or something, but it's like, we
Mhm.
know what really happened here. So dealing with that tension of like, what does the written record say, and what is the story that's passed on kind of internally within the family, is really interesting.
Yeah. And the importance of both.
Mhm. Mhm. Definitely.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry for that tangent.
Oh, no. That's great.
We've been thinking so much about archival work, in my family lately, and then my sister is a historian. She deals exclusively with the archives.
Mhm.
So these are conversations that we are continually having, and I'm always struck by what doing this archival work means and how
Mhm.
important it is in this moment when there are so many efforts to just delete,
Mhm.
just to hit delete on the archives and to not have that work be present, much less known. So,
Mhm. Mhm. And I think that's such a why it's important to kind of not just do this work within the academy, because you have to think about, like, if someone's not, doesn't have access to higher education, how might they still be able to learn? And that so much of that is kind of going and into these spaces that have long historically been the same spaces where learning occurs. So it's the churches, it's the after school programs, it's the fraternity, the sorority, like, it's all of these
mhm.
spaces that if you reach out to them, they themselves have records, but also that's just another avenue for, you know, learning about Black history, and remaining kind of, connected to them and not kind of just thinking more so extractive than, how
Yeah,
might we collaborate together and hearing your story just as you kind of are able to access this information that we're producing.
absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you so, so much. I'm not going to take up much more of your first week. Happy first week. I hope
Thank
that
you.
it goes well and that you have a wonderful school year. And I'd greatly appreciate you taking time out to talk to me today.
Of course. Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.